Okay, now we're going to look at our third learning objective, which is to look at the structure of ISO 9001 and its focus on the process orientation as opposed to focus on isolated activities. The 2000 revision of ISO 9000 transformed the standard from an activity-based quality system, that is, where you focused on individual activities like purchasing, statistical methods, segregation of non-conforming products. There were actually individual provisions for every one of those activities. It was transformed to a process-based quality system where you have this model for continuous quality improvements similar to your plan, do, check, act, or other continuous improvement cycles. This is actually from the 2008 standard, adapted from the 2008 standard. Their figure does not show provision for quality management system general requirements, but that's the foundation for the entire improvement cycle. Provision 4 includes not only the requirements for a quality management system, but also the documentation requirements. You have at the top management responsibility, which is provision 5, which is influenced by two-way communications with the customer. Then management is responsible for, among other things, resource management, provision of appropriate resources to operate the quality system. That in turn supports product realization. Provision 7 includes every aspect of product realization, including design for manufacture, purchasing, actual production, preservation of product, which again was a separate activity under the older versions of the standard, and finally shipment to the customer. That also is influenced by customer requirements, and actually you have there, that goes into the design aspect, where you have, for example, quality function deployment, which gets the voice of the customer into your product design, planning for quality activities such as process failure mode analysis, design failure node analysis, the control plan, which shows how you're going to control critical to quality characteristics and every other aspect of production, and then from product realization you have output to your customer. Then you have measurement, analysis, and improvement. That includes not only process data, but also information, for example, feedback from customers on how well you're satisfying your customer requirements. That in turn is reviewed by management. That goes back to management responsibility, which includes management review for continuous improvement of the quality management system. Measurement, analysis, and improvement also includes, for example, closed-loop corrective action and closed-loop preventive action. Provision for your quality management system includes the general requirements and also your documentation requirements. These include a mandatory quality manual, which is again at the top of the 4-tier document system. It deploys ISO 9001 as through a first-tier document. Control of documents, that means making sure that people who are supposed to use documents, like production workers, know what the current documents are, have reviewed them, and have available current documents, and also that any obsolete documents are withdrawn from the system. Also control of quality records, which includes not only having the quality records, remember, do what you say and say what you do. Records show that you did what you said you do. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And this particular provision also includes requirements for preservation against loss. If I were auditing an activity, I would be shown a quality record. I'd say, all right, suppose this record was destroyed either by accident, by a fire, or maybe by a flood, or if it's on a computer, a hard drive crash. How can you recover this information? which suggests that the information should in fact be stored in two different places at least. Document control, by the way, we'll see later on under the major pitfalls section, is one of the three biggest contributors to quality system nonconformances, although it's almost entirely preventable with a good document control system. Provision 5, management responsibility. It defines the responsibility of management for making the quality system work. It's very important for management to lead by example and through action. Includes the setting of appropriate performance measurements because people respond to control measurements. For example, if you're measuring a department on the number of products it gets out, its focus is going to be on getting product out the door as opposed to, for example, quality, and that's where a lot of quality problems happen. That, as a matter of fact, has happened in the past, where they end up shipping scrap or other non-conforming materials simply because they have to get it out the door. So management has to set appropriate measurements. Management also has to participate in the quality-related activities. There was an example where a CEO asked W. Edwards Deming to teach his people how to use total quality management, so they brought Deming in. The CEO introduced Deming and then walked out of the room, basically destroyed all interest in the program, even though they had W. Edwards Deming himself, because the CEO didn't stay to listen to Deming himself. Other things, Gemba management. Gemba is Japanese for the value-adding workplace, as opposed to, for example, a corner office. So going to Gemba is a very important part of management responsibility. Henry Ford, by the way, spent so much time on the factory floor he actually didn't attend to administrative work like paying bills and collecting payments that were owed to him. He was lucky he had a good accountant to do those things for him, because he spent all his time on the factory floor, but with obvious results. Provision of resources includes the physical resources for the job. Includes buildings, equipment, information technology, in some cases environmental controls. Certainly in the semiconductor industry, you have to provide clean room technology. In many other activities, you have temperature and humidity requirements. Also the human resources. You ask an auditor could ask how is the person qualified to do this particular job, and you need to produce a training record or some other evidence that shows that the person is in fact qualified to do the job. Product realization includes most of the supply chain activities, starting from purchasing, like how do you know that what your supplier is delivering is good, is usable in your production process. Product traceability, you have to be able to trace the materials and parts that go into a completed product in case something is wrong with it. Preservation of product, how do you protect the product from damage during shipment? For example, they have shock indicators that show that if a container with something fragile and it was dropped or mishandled, it'll change color or give some other indication if it's subjected to a certain G-force. Temperature indicators for perishable items, those will change color if they exceed a specified temperature. Certainly the manner in which the item is packaged. Does the packaging prevent damage? All those are aspects of preservation of product. Calibration of gauges and instruments. That's one of the three major sources of findings during audits, because there are so many things that can go wrong with it. A gauge being found past its calibration date, for example, is a non-conformance. It means you really don't know what you're measuring. You have a bunch of measurements and you don't know if they're accurate. In some cases you may actually have to have a product recall as a result. However, there are computerized systems that work like clockwork, and in that case you won't find any gauges that have missed their calibration dates. Provision 8, measurement, analysis, and improvement, covers collection and analysis of all relevant data. This includes finding from internal audits which have to be reviewed by management. There has to be closure on those audit findings. Now, when you close an audit finding, that goes beyond removing the problem that caused that particular finding. For example, if you find an obsolete document in an area, replacement of the obsolete document is not a real solution. You have to find out why the system allowed an obsolete document to be present in the first place. It's sort of like finding one termite. Killing that individual termite doesn't necessarily solve your problem, because when there's one, there's usually more of them. Provision 8 also includes the mandatory closed-loop corrective and preventive action process. The Automotive Industry Action Group has a very excellent reference on this called Effective Problem-Solving Guideline. The one problem is if you're not an AIAG member, or if your company isn't a member, it costs, I believe, $150. If you are a member, it's only $25. Membership is $500 for small organizations, then works its way up depending on the amount of sales. That is unfortunately expensive because it's an outstanding reference for a corrective and preventive action process. How do we implement ISO 9001? The key question is to ask questions like, how do we, in other words, how do we do a particular job? How do we do an inspection? How do we ensure quality? And this is the say what you do aspect of ISO 9000, and those, of course, have to be documented. The next question is, how do we know that we did it? In other words, do what you say. And that's where we have quality records and audits. And remember, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. If the work instruction, for example, calls for preventive maintenance of a piece of equipment, then you have to write down somewhere, like on a preventive maintenance log, which is a quality record, when and by who the preventive maintenance was performed. That's how you show an auditor that you did it. That's how the person who has to run that piece of equipment knows that it was done. The reason, by the way, they have so few airplane crashes is because the pilots go through a checklist like that very carefully. Of course, their lives as well as that of their passengers depends on that checklist. So they make very sure that they do what they're supposed to do, and they have a list that they go through to make sure that they did it. Fourth learning objective, major pitfalls. Largest non-conformance sources for ISO 9000 systems. The reference is from an article written in 1996 in Manufacturing Engineering magazine by Robert Baker. It says, why companies fail quality audits. The three major sources are document control, simply because unless you have probably a computerized system, there's simply so much that can go wrong with it. If you have paper documents that have to be updated, you have to make absolutely sure that you collect all the obsolete documents, that nobody has photocopies of documents, obsolete documents lying around in the factory, or anything else of that nature. I believe one company used a type of paper where if you photocopied it, said it automatically printed on every page, copy not valid for production or something, which automatically made sure that there were no copies like that lying around. But there's a lot of things that can go wrong with document control. However, a good computer-controlled system, you shouldn't have problem with that. Calibration, another one. You look for those green stickers on the instruments. Anything used to control a critical quality characteristic has to be calibrated. And again, there are computerized systems that will make that run like clockwork, and you shouldn't have any problems. Otherwise, that can be another major source of problems. Finally, inspection and testing is the third major source of nonconformances. Okay, last learning objective, audits, friend or foe. Okay, audit sounds bad. I mean, who wants to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service? However, audits, if used properly and if viewed properly, are valuable quality improvement tools that, again, prevent problems and promote continuous improvement of the quality system. For an internal audit, That's called a first-party audit. The second-party audit is by a customer. A third-party audit is by an impartial third party, like, for example, a quality system registrar. So an internal audit is a self-assessment that tries to find problems with the quality system that could result in scrap, rework, or other difficulties. And the idea is to prevent potential trouble from becoming actual trouble. Remember again the story of the 3 Chinese doctors. The eldest one kept the diseases from happening, so nobody ever heard of him. That is a function of quality audits as well. Or perhaps the second doctor who saw the diseases when they got started and treated them before they caused any real trouble. Always remember that audits focus on things and not people. The reason you get hostility to audits is because if the people in the work area think you're coming in looking to find them doing things wrong and write them up, they're certainly not going to cooperate with any such efforts. If there are defects or problems, they'll try to hide them, sweep them under the rug, and of course it's what you don't know that will hurt you at some point. So you have to approach the audit from the perspective that you're focusing on the system in which the people work as opposed to the people themselves. There's incidentally a big problem with this in the medical profession, where if a patient is injured by a medical mistake, or even if there's a near miss, the hospital administration focuses on looking for which nurse to blame so they can take disciplinary action against the nurse. Well, of course, if a nurse almost connects the wrong tubes or gives the patient the wrong medication, the nurse will try to hide that because then otherwise she'll be written up. Now, under intelligent management, and this is done in Japan, they have something called a HIARI, which stands for scare report, where if the worker catches himself or herself doing something wrong or about to do something wrong, the worker files a report, and the focus is not, hey, this worker almost made a mistake. The focus is on, why was it possible for this worker to make a mistake? Because if it is possible to make a mistake, remember that any job that requires operator vigilance to prevent errors is a quality problem waiting for a place to happen. They go in and they change that job to make that mistake by the worker who reported it or by any other worker impossible. Now, if they did the same thing in hospitals, a nurse makes a mistake or catches an almost mistake, reports it, and they do something by changing the job. For example, it's possible to make it impossible to connect a feeding tube to an intravenous tube. Then that kind of mistake can never happen. No patient is ever harmed, and no nurse ever makes that mistake. That's what the focus should be, on the system, on the job, and never on the people. So ideally, if you're running an ISO 9001 system, you should empower your workers, assuming they understand the quality system, to themselves file audit findings if they find a potential nonconformance in their area, which has the force of an actual internal audit finding, perhaps after review by somebody who is skilled and knowledgeable with the standard itself. That is what makes the audit your friend and not the enemy. Finally, audits should be narrative. My own preference is to begin every audit question with one of the indicated words: who, what, when, where, how, or why, with who relating not to a person by name, but by a job position. That's important, because if you put someone's name in and the person changes jobs, then your information actually is not accurate. So that should precede most audit questions, and what you want is a narrative response as opposed to yes, no, or a checklist, because that gives you some actual detail as to how your quality system works and how the job is being done. Also, the narrative answers can be shared as best practices. Remember, progress comes from sharing information. Okay, I'll now summarize the key takeaways from this presentation. First, if you're trying to get buy-in from your workforce or even from your management team, why do ISO 9000? The ISO 9000 was developed in response to the need to manage quality in complex systems and even through supply chain. Remember, there are provisions for purchasing. How do you make sure what your supplier is giving you meets quality requirements, as well as how do you make sure you're meeting your own customers' quality requirements. So there's a process perspective, supplier input, process output, customer perspective on this whole thing. And remember that 80 to 85% of all trouble, like scrap or rework, comes not from people, but rather from deficiencies in the system in which the people have to work, and that's what ISO 9001 focuses on. A lot of resistance to ISO 9001 comes from the perspective that it's a costly and time-consuming annoyance, that we have to do it to make our customers happy because our customers want it, because marketing thinks it looks good. That's the wrong reason. ISO 9001 has done the right thing, but for the wrong reason, and then when viewed in that manner, it is indeed a costly and time-consuming annoyance. When you treat it as a means to an end, in other words, a framework to maintain and improve quality, that prevents genuine costly and time-consuming annoyances, like, for example, external failure, where you get returns from your customer who isn't very happy about receiving non-conforming materials. In that sense, it's like the eldest of the Chinese doctors who prevented the illnesses from ever happening, so he was never heard of outside his village, and people pretty much forgot he existed, but he was perhaps the most important of the three. ISO 9000 is often described as say what you do. That means having documented procedures, work instructions, and so on, and then doing what you say, which means keeping quality records to show that you did it. Remember, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen, and that certainly applies to quality records. The purpose of documentation is to hold the gains. That's a key phrase from quality management. Like a ratchet, that if you're lifting a load and your grip slips on the load, you don't lose all the work that you put into raising that load. It holds the gains and it prevents backsliding. The best way to avoid pushback on audits is to remember that audits focus on the system and not on people. As soon as you place the focus on the system in which people must work, as opposed to looking to find people doing things wrong and writing them up, the attitude of the people towards the audits is going to change very quickly, and perhaps in a real world-class organization, you'll have people performing effectively, auditing themselves. When they see something that's wrong with their job or could go wrong with their job, they file a HIARI or SCARE report. I believe there was something similar in American factories called an error cause removal program, where if the workers saw a potential error cause or potential defect cause, they could file a report, and something was done to make that particular defect or mistake impossible. Also, audits should be narrative. Always precede audit questions with who, relating to a job position, what, when, where, how, or why, and get a narrative as opposed to a yes-no response. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll find ISO 9001 valuable to your company and its goals of continuous quality improvement, and I'll be happy to take any questions.